Welcome back to Rapture Tales. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and get ready for another story you won't forget. Let's dive back to the story. Caroline Jacob learned, long before she learned patience or forgiveness, that silence could be louder than shouting. The house she lived in after her father's death was large, pristine, and admired by outsiders. Yet every polished surface reflected a truth no one acknowledged aloud: she did not belong there. The Williams household ran on hierarchy, and Caroline sat firmly at the bottom. Judith Williams, her stepmother, was a woman who wore elegance like armor. She spoke softly, smiled often, and never raised her voice, yet every word she directed at Caroline carried a quiet contempt that lingered long after the conversation ended. Judith believed in appearances above all else, and Caroline's presence in the house was tolerated only because removing her outright would have damaged Judith's carefully constructed image of benevolence. Pamela Williams, Judith's daughter, inherited her mother's cruelty without the discipline to disguise it. Where Judith was calculated, Pamela was reckless. She mocked Caroline openly, dismissed her ambitions, and took a particular pleasure in reminding her that everything she enjoyed, food, shelter, education, was a favor granted by Judith's generosity. Caroline endured it because she had no alternative. Her biological mother had died years earlier, and her father's sudden illness and death left her unmoored, financially dependent, and emotionally isolated. Yet despite the hostility, Caroline refused to shrink. She worked relentlessly, waking before dawn to prepare herself for the day, commuting across the city to her job at a mid-sized architectural design firm where she served as a junior project coordinator. Architecture was not just a career path for her, it was a quiet rebellion. She loved structures, not for their grandeur, but for their logic, how every beam served a purpose, how nothing stood without support. In buildings, she found the order her life lacked. She spent evenings sketching designs in a battered notebook, dreaming of creating spaces that felt like safety rather than imprisonment. Those dreams, however, were invisible to the Williams family. To them, Caroline was merely a dependent, a reminder of Judith's husband's past life, an inconvenience to be managed. Judith's plans for Caroline had begun forming long before Caroline realized she was part of a strategy. Judith had always viewed relationships as transactions, and Caroline was an asset wasting away if left unmanaged. The problem, in Judith's mind, was that Caroline was becoming too independent. She had opinions, ambitions, and worse, options. Judith noticed the subtle changes first: Caroline staying late at work, declining family outings, spending less time under Judith's watchful eye. Independence threatened control, and Judith did not tolerate threats. Pamela, ever eager to please her mother, fueled the fire by exaggerating Caroline's actions, painting her as ungrateful and rebellious. Together, mother and daughter began discussing solutions over private dinners and hushed conversations, framing their intentions as concern for Caroline's future while plotting to bind her permanently to their influence. While Caroline navigated her constrained world, Timothy Barnes lived in a reality so carefully disguised that even those closest to him misunderstood it. To the public eye, when he was seen at all, Timothy was unremarkable. He dressed simply, spoke slowly, and avoided attention with an almost painful diligence. He lived in a modest apartment far from the glass towers bearing the logos of companies he secretly controlled. The truth was that Timothy Barnes was the majority shareholder and strategic brain behind one of the fastest-growing technology conglomerates in the country. Years earlier, he had chosen anonymity not out of fear, but out of exhaustion. Fame had stripped him of genuine connection, leaving him surrounded by people who spoke to his net worth rather than to him. Disguising himself as an ordinary, intellectually unimpressive man became his shield, a way to observe the world without being hunted by it. Timothy's intelligence was not performative. He did not need to prove it. He spent his nights analyzing markets, refining algorithms, and mentoring a small, fiercely loyal executive team that respected his wish for secrecy. His days, however, were deliberately dull. He worked part-time at a logistics consultancy under an assumed role, allowing him to gather data and observe human behavior without suspicion. Many mistook his quiet nature for dullness, his measured speech for slowness. Timothy never corrected them. Being underestimated was freedom. Yet beneath his calm exterior, he carried his own wounds, a childhood marked by neglect, wealth without warmth, and parents who treated him as an extension of their legacy rather than a person. The first time Caroline and Timothy crossed paths, It was entirely unremarkable, which was precisely why it mattered. They met in a crowded public transit station during a city-wide delay. Caroline, already exhausted from a long day, dropped her sketchbook while navigating through the chaos. Papers scattered across the floor, drawings of half-finished buildings and imagined skylines slipping beneath strangers' feet. Timothy noticed immediately. He knelt without hesitation, carefully gathering each page, studying them not with judgment but with curiosity. When he handed the sketchbook back to her, he did so quietly, simply saying that the designs felt honest. The word startled Caroline. No one had ever described her work that way before. She thanked him, expecting the interaction to end there, but instead they found themselves standing side by side, waiting, talking about nothing important and everything meaningful. Their conversations became a routine coincidence. They began encountering each other at the same coffee shop near Caroline's office, then at the station, then at a small public park where Timothy liked to read during lunch breaks. Caroline found his presence soothing. He never interrupted her, never offered unsolicited advice, never made her feel like she had to perform. Timothy, in turn, was drawn to Caroline's resilience, the way she spoke carefully but passionately, the way her eyes softened when discussing architecture, the way she never complained yet carried visible weight on her shoulders. He did not tell her who he was. He did not lie either. He simply let her know him as Timothy, a man content with simplicity. As Caroline's connection with Timothy deepened, tensions at home escalated. Judith sensed the shift immediately. Caroline smiled more, carried herself differently, and, most troubling of all, seemed less afraid. Judith began probing, asking questions masked as concern, attempting to uncover the source of Caroline's newfound confidence. Pamela took a more direct approach, following Caroline one evening and witnessing her laughter with Timothy from a distance. The sight disgusted her, not because of romance, but because Timothy appeared ordinary, unimpressive, someone Pamela deemed beneath Caroline's station, ironic as that judgment was. Pamela reported everything to Judith, embellishing Timothy into a useless distraction, an idiot who would drag Caroline down if allowed to linger. Judith made her decision that night. If Caroline was forming attachments outside her control, then it was time to accelerate her plans. Marriage, Judith believed, would solve everything. A husband chosen by the family would anchor Caroline permanently, strip her of autonomy, and reinforce Judith's dominance under the guise of tradition and responsibility. The irony, that Judith herself despised weakness, did not escape her. What she wanted was not a strong partner for Caroline, but a manageable one. Someone harmless. Someone easily dismissed. Someone she could manipulate. The idea of using Timothy, the very man Caroline had grown close to, had not yet crossed her mind. But fate, already in motion, was quietly aligning paths. And while Caroline stood at the edge of something hopeful, unaware of the storm forming behind her, Timothy began to feel something he had long avoided: attachment. Real, dangerous, unguarded attachment. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed detachment began to crack, not because Caroline demanded anything of him, but because she saw him. Not as a genius. Not as a billionaire. Just as a man. Judith Williams did not announce her intentions the way ordinary people did. She prepared the ground first. Subtle restrictions appeared in Caroline's life like invisible fences. Her access to the family car was revoked under the excuse of repairs that never happened. Household responsibilities increased, framed as learning discipline. Even her schedule at work became a point of interrogation, Judith asking pointed questions about overtime and meetings that felt less like concern and more like surveillance. Caroline sensed the shift immediately. The house grew colder, quieter, more watchful. Pamela amplified the tension by inserting herself into Caroline's routines, casually reminding her of her dependence and hinting that Judith had plans for her future that Caroline would be wise not to resist. Caroline tried to ignore it, grounding herself in her work and in the quiet moments she shared with Timothy, unaware that those moments were already being counted against her. The confrontation came not with shouting, but with ceremony. Judith invited Caroline to a formal family dinner, one that felt more like a negotiation table than a meal. The table was set elaborately, the atmosphere heavy with expectation. Judith spoke of responsibility, of gratitude, of the sacrifices she had made raising Caroline. She framed marriage as a solution, a gift, a stabilizing force that would secure Caroline's future. When Caroline objected, carefully, respectfully, Judith's tone hardened. Pamela joined in, accusing Caroline of selfishness and ingratitude, painting her independence as rebellion. Caroline realized then that the decision had already been made. Her consent was not being sought, it was being managed. The name Timothy Barnes entered the conversation like a calculated insult. Judith described him dismissively, emphasizing his simplicity, his lack of ambition, his supposed intellectual shortcomings. She called him safe, harmless, an idiot, though she softened the word with a polite smile. Caroline felt the room tilt. Judith had not chosen a stranger. She had chosen the one person Caroline cared about. The cruelty of it struck deeper than any insult. Judith framed it as fate, coincidence, even kindness, allowing Caroline to marry someone familiar rather than a complete unknown. Caroline tried to explain, to argue that Timothy deserved better than being used as leverage, but her words were dismissed as emotional nonsense. The marriage, Judith insisted, would happen quickly, efficiently, publicly. When Caroline told Timothy, she expected anger or confusion. What she did not expect was calm. Timothy listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He asked questions, not to challenge her, but to understand the machinery closing around her. He saw Judith's move for what it was, control disguised as benevolence. Timothy agreed to the marriage not because he was unaware of the insult attached to it, but because he recognized the opportunity. This was not surrender. It was strategy. Still, when he looked at Caroline, there was no triumph in his eyes, only concern and something deeper, heavier. He promised her one thing, that she would never regret trusting him, even if she did not yet understand how. The wedding preparations were swift and impersonal. Judith took full control, excluding Caroline from most decisions under the pretense of efficiency. Pamela reveled in the process, ensuring every detail reinforced her narrative of Caroline's humiliation. Timothy played his role perfectly. He appeared awkward in formal fittings, spoke minimally, and allowed himself to be underestimated at every turn. Judith grew more confident with each interaction, convinced she had secured a compliant son-in-law who would never challenge her authority. What she did not see were the quiet conversations Timothy held with his legal team, the documents being prepared, the silent restructuring of power happening beyond her awareness. Marriage changed the dynamics immediately, though not in the way Judith expected. Timothy moved Caroline out of the Williams house under the reasonable excuse of independence, establishing their own modest home. The distance weakened Judith's direct control, and Pamela's influence evaporated without proximity. Caroline began to see Timothy differently, not as the gentle man she met by chance, but as someone deliberately patient, observant, and profoundly protective. He encouraged her ambitions, supported her work, and created space for her voice to exist without interruption. Love grew not from grand gestures, but from consistency, from safety, from the quiet realization that she was no longer alone. Judith's unease grew as her authority slipped. She attempted to reassert control through financial pressure and social manipulation, but Timothy absorbed every move calmly, neutralizing each attempt without confrontation. When the revelation finally came, it was not dramatic, it was devastating. Judith discovered Timothy's true identity not through gossip, but through documentation, through contracts she no longer controlled, through the realization that the company she had tried to influence was now under Timothy's authority. The idiot she dismissed was the architect of her collapse. Caroline learned the truth privately. Timothy told her everything, his wealth, his disguise, his reasons. He did not frame it as a reveal, but as an explanation. Caroline's reaction was not anger, but grief for the loneliness he had endured. She chose him again, this time with full knowledge. Together, they confronted Judith not with revenge, but with boundaries. Pamela faded into irrelevance, her cruelty powerless without influence. Judith, stripped of control, was left with the consequences of her own manipulations. In the end, Caroline built more than a life, she built autonomy. She advanced in her career, designed spaces that reflected her values, and stood beside Timothy not as a beneficiary of his wealth, but as his equal. Their story was not about humiliation reversed by power, but about dignity reclaimed through patience, intelligence, and love. And Judith learned, too late, that underestimating someone did not make them small, it only revealed her own blindness. That's all for today. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Stay tuned.